So with all that in mind, and with all the add-ons and all these sort of bars and charts and the chat and everything, take another look at the fight continued. So when you're watching this, you can try to start paying attention to like that thing in the middle,
I'm seeing up there,
and all the lines that are sort of ever increasing.
Melee, go for it.
There's this my health right here, the monster's health right here.
Oh, it's yours instead.
You know, and you can see all of us sort of tightly bunched up fighting him.
You got one of these.
Much for roads.
So that sound you hear, the bong and the ding, those are things that
Alright, ask to use all yours.
everyone has installed to tell us when something's about to happen so that we can react to it before.
Okay, then use mine.
Is there a general rule of this?
We have a raid leader who's basically telling us. So
there are 40 people participating in that?
Mm-hmm.
How do you figure out who's allowed to talk? Because obviously not all 40 people are talking.
Right. So most of the time, the voice chat was reserved for the raid leaders, although it was never said out loud. Like it wasn't never explicitly. That was never an explicit rule. But generally, when we were engaged in the middle of a fight, only the raid leaders talked.
Kind of form a military structure at that point.
Mm-hmm. And then when we weren't fighting, when it was the sort of downtime between fights, then everyone sort of felt free to talk. Other people who needed to communicate during those moments just basically used the text chat.
So earlier you mentioned you could tell joviality, right? But I'm assuming you don't have joviality as a sign of something good during a raid.
Yeah, it's usually sort of between fights when we're making jokes with each other and things like that. Although you saw when at the very beginning, that video when he was starting to get summoned, like that was time when that was sort of idle, where we were making jokes. You know, he's not that tough and stuff like that. So how a fight works, and I'm not sure how much time I have, but
8 minutes or so.
Okay, I think I can do this. It's okay, John. So there's sort of 3 roles that you can play in the game based off of these character classes that you've chosen. There's 8 character classes that you can choose from, but once you choose one, you're sort of playing one of these 3 roles in a fight. There's tank, healer, and DPS, and I'll cover that really quickly, and then I'll talk about threat and aggro, which is something else that you have to keep track of, and basically I'll cover all this stuff. So let's say there's this monster out in the wild, just roaming around, and a group of players happen upon it and want to attack it. This guy right here, who's a warrior, he basically yells at the monster, "Yo, over here, come get me!" And the other players then spread out and get into positions. This is called grabbing aggro, or grabbing aggravation, or getting the attention of the monster. So everyone spreads out, and each of us is playing a particular role. So like the rogue is playing a DPS, which basically stands for damage per second, which is the label that's used for the characters who do a lot of damage to the monsters. It's also the way of measuring their performance. So they're doing X damage per second, and so you want to try to maximize that. And then mage is another type of DPS. So the warrior is what's known as a tank, and basically known as a tank because he has a lot of armor, or she has a lot of armor, and can take a lot of hits without dying. And then the priest is the healer, and his or her job is to then heal everyone else in the group, but mostly heal the tank while the tank is being hit by this monster. So the priest is giving love to the warrior, and the mage and the rogue are basically attacking the monster, right? The mage is pew-pewing against it, and then the rogue is activating these abilities called Sinister Strike and Eviscerate, SSSS, Eviscerate. So the way the warrior grabs its attention is basically by activating abilities. Every time you activate an ability in World of Warcraft, you do a certain amount of damage or you do some sort of effect, right? And each ability that you activate has what's attached to it, this number sort of behind the scenes called threat number or threat level. And the warrior has the monster's attention because it poses the most threat to the monster. It has the highest threat level. And if you were to graph or create a table of what threat looks like, every time Wendy, who's a warrior, uses Sunder, she gets 260 threat added to her threat level. And if her existing threat level is at 780, she now has 1040. And everyone else who's activating abilities does a certain amount of damage and also generates a certain amount of threat. And you basically want to make sure that the warrior always has the highest amount of threat. But all that was in our heads. We didn't know who had what, really, until this add-on came out. This thing called Threat Meter, or KTM, was the first. KTM is the name of the first Threat Meter add-on that came out in the game. Now there's like a ton of them. K stands for Kenko. Kenko is the name of a player who was on the European servers, and he wrote this lengthy article on the European forums for World of Warcraft, basically dispelling a whole bunch of misconceptions about how threat worked in the game. And he's like, you can actually test this out, and you can like change certain variables and stuff and see how much threat each of your abilities is generating, and you can actually predict then when people are going to start getting threat. And so why don't I create this add-on that does it for you? And so he did. And so this thing right here is basically a bar chart of how much threat we have in relation to the guy at the top who's a tank.
Wow.
And so while you're fighting or activating ability, your threat level is starting to increment, but then everyone else's is also, and you can just make sure that the rate of the rate of your gain isn't higher than the tanks, or that you're never actually going to go over 100%. And that's how. And so when this came out, we became way more efficient in our fighting, right? Because we no longer had to guess if we were pushing the envelope or not. We didn't even know where the envelope was, right? And so now we know where that line is, where that critical point is, and we can basically push our ability until we're just riding on the edge of that line, and be much more efficient and not in danger of grabbing aggro and then dying, because if you're not a tank, as soon as the monster hits you, you're dead pretty much. So all this matters in this fight with Ragnaros. So this is the guy at the very beginning that we looked at emerging from the lava. He has this thing called knockback, which basically means whoever's near him will be thrown backwards periodically. And when that happens, you get a lot of damage, and this is me dead after a knockback. And when these knockbacks happened, after they happened, everyone has to run back into position, right, to keep doing damage to them. For some reason, the rogues in this fight, so this is, we hit Ragnaros about midway through our raid life, so probably about mid-March. So we're fighting Ragnaros starting mid-March, which and into April and into May before we were able to kill him for the first time. And the first time we met him, so you can see, I don't have the threat meter add-on. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, and the other rogues don't know why we're dying, really. We think it has to do with threat, and we think we're getting hit by Ragnaros because we're grabbing aggro because our threat level is the highest. But in actuality, after we installed the add-on, we could start seeing that our threat wasn't anywhere close to the tank's threat. So what's actually going on? It isn't that we're doing too much damage. It must be some other reason. And so when we installed the add-on later in late March and early April, we started talking about it and trying to diagnose what was going on. So this there's a steady high DPS fight, no bursting. Bursting will get you aggro. So this is sort of still evidence. This is one of the rogues of. We were thinking that threat was the reason, right? You don't want to burst, you don't want to gain too much threat, you don't want to grab aggro. And then in the fight, somebody died, and I got aggro on that one. Not sure how. It's the same. I was doing the same thing as last time, you know. And last time I didn't die, so why did I die this time? And then I wrote this actually. So I have threat meter, and then I noticed I wasn't very high up, and I was able to do this ability, and I still wasn't even high up. So I suggest you get this add-on because it'll help you judge whether or not you have too much threat. And so at this point, I'm still thinking it's possible that threat is the reason why these other rogues are dying. But then the first guy in the next fight, our next attempt at Ragnaros, he died, and he's like, I hit him once. That made no sense. And if you look at the color of this chat, so the stuff in top is talk that we were having amongst ourselves in that private rogue channel. Then he wrote something in the larger raid group channel, so broadcasting it to all 40 players, you know, basically just being flabbergasted. And then our raid leader replied with this: Roger, that's an alias by the way, the tanks, may have been out of position for just a second, which is enough for anyone else to get aggro. Which basically, if you take that and then add it to what we were seeing on the threat meter, you suddenly realize, oh, you know, threat isn't the reason why we were dying. It's because we were running back into position after a knockback before the tanks were able to run back into position. And what Ragnaros does is he kills or he targets whoever is within melee range who has the highest threat level. But if you're a rogue and you're there before a tank, then you have the highest threat level, right? And so even though the meter doesn't tell us that, you know, we were able to figure out basically that's what was happening.
Amazing feedback system.
Yeah, and so what's interesting, I think, about this add-on that we were using for the Ragnaros fight, it was as soon as we sort of discovered this, we also sort of discovered that we didn't even need the add-on anymore for the fight, right? Because we were nowhere close to the tank's aggro or tank's threat level, and so the threat meter itself only played sort of a temporary role in just helping us diagnose what was wrong with the fight, rather than playing its designed role, which is to help us be efficient all the time, you know. And a couple weeks later, we were able to kill Ragnaros for the first time. Okay, so in conclusion, becoming an expert depended on access to expert groups, which basically means you have access to the social material practices that sort of has emerged through the play. That has become like standard as what expert practice is. Not all players could do that. Group success depended on coordinated action and trust in others, and disruptions to the network. So, for example, getting aggro required renegotiation of roles. You know, enrolling other things into our configuration to help us figure out what was going on, and complete failure required total reconfiguration of how we were organized. And the takeaways: cognitive frameworks for expertise don't account for this emergent, deeply situated ways that social material practice happens. And then new actors, so tools and people actually to the network, require a redistribution of roles and responsibilities, and again is really specifically nuanced to local settings. That's it. And if we had time, we could have watched this more.